Hi friends, today I am giving a lecture on compare preemptive scheduling and non-preemptive scheduling in operating system. It is one of the most important concept in operating system. This concept can be asked in external exam point of view and also many companies interviews. Scheduling of a process can be done in two ways. One is preemptive scheduling and second one is non-preemptive scheduling. Before scheduling of a process, first of all, what is scheduling? Scheduling is nothing but assigning the CPU to a process for its execution is called as scheduling of a process. Scheduling can be done in two ways. One is preemptive scheduling and the second one is non-preemptive scheduling. In preemptive scheduling, once the CPU is allocated to a process, then it can be interrupted in the middle of the execution of a process. Is nothing but preemptive scheduling. In non-preemptive scheduling, once the CPU is allocated to a process, it cannot be interrupted in the middle of the execution until it's completed its execution of a particular process. So it is the main difference between preemptive scheduling and non-preemptive scheduling. Now we go for what are the differences or comparisons between preemptive scheduling and non-preemptive scheduling. The first point in preemptive scheduling is, in preemptive scheduling, the executing process is interrupted in the middle of the execution of a process. Okay, the executing process can be interrupted in preemptive scheduling. The executing process can be interrupted in the middle of the execution. Suppose a CPU is allocated to a particular process. Okay, then in the middle of the execution of the process, then that process can be interrupted. Okay, but in the case of non-preemptive scheduling, the executing process cannot be interrupted in the middle of the execution until it's complete its execution. Next, second difference is the resources are allocated to a particular process for a limited amount of time. Okay, for a limited amount of time, okay, we can allocate the resources to a particular process in a preemptive scheduling. In the non-preemptive scheduling, once the resources are allocated to a particular process, that resources are not released until the process completes its execution. Next one is preemptive scheduling is flexible, whereas non-preemptive scheduling is not flexible. Because how we can say that preemptive scheduling is flexible? Suppose one process is scheduling by the CPU, so then another highest priority process is waiting in the ready queue. So then immediately the executing process can be interrupted so then the CPU can be allocated to a highest priority process in the ready queue. So hence we can say that the preemptive scheduling is flexible, whereas non-preemptive scheduling is not flexible, because once the CPU is allocated to a particular process, it cannot be interrupted until it's completed its execution of the process. So then we can say that non-preemptive scheduling is not flexible. Next one, preemptive scheduling is cost associative. So preemptive scheduling requires more cost, whereas non-preemptive scheduling is less cost, because here process switching can be done more, whereas non-preemptive scheduling process switching cannot be done. So because of that reason, preemptive scheduling is more cost effective, whereas in non-preemptive scheduling is not cost associative. Next one is preemptive scheduling has the overhead of scheduling the processes. So some overhead is there in scheduling the processes in preemptive scheduling, whereas in the non-preemptive scheduling there is no overhead of scheduling the process, because once the CPU is allocated to a particular process, it cannot be interrupted until it completes its execution. Whereas in the case of preemptive scheduling, so the CPU can be switched from lowest priority process to highest priority process. So that can be done for a limited amount of time. Once the time is completed, again the CPU is allocated to a lowest priority process. So this is the overhead that can be occurred in preemptive scheduling. But whereas in the case of non-preemptive scheduling, there is no overhead of scheduling the process. Next one is, in preemptive scheduling, a running process may be replaced by a highest priority process at any time. Okay, so that means suppose there are two processes are there. One process is already executing by the CPU, that has the lowest priority process. Next one is another process is waiting in the ready queue. So that has the highest priority process. So in preemptive scheduling, whenever a highest priority process is waiting in the ready queue, so that can be replaced by the lowest priority process. So then the lowest priority process can release the CPU. That CPU is allocated to the highest priority process in the ready queue. Okay. Whereas in the case of non-preemptive scheduling, the CPU is allocated to a particular process whenever any highest priority process occurred. So then it does not relinquish the control of the CPU of the lowest priority process. If it completed its execution of the lowest priority process, then it releases the CPU. Otherwise, it does not release the CPU. So that is the concept behind in non-preemptive scheduling. Next difference is preemptive scheduling is more complex, because more number of switchings can be done in preemptive scheduling, so that we can say that preemptive scheduling is more complex. But whereas non-preemptive scheduling is simple, non-preemptive scheduling is simple because only less number of switchings can be done between the processes. Okay. Next one is preemptive scheduling is also affects the design of operating system kernel. So preemptive scheduling affected the design of operating system kernel, whereas in the case of non-preemptive scheduling, it does not affect the design of operating system kernel. So preemptive scheduling also affects the design of the operating system kernel. It affects the design of operating system kernel in the case of preemptive scheduling, whereas in the case of non-preemptive scheduling, it does not affect the design of operating system kernel. Next one is preemptive scheduling is not attracted by the users because more number of switchings can be done between the processes. So somewhat difficulty is there for understanding of the switching between the processes. So non-preemptive scheduling is more attractive by the users. It is very easy to understand by the users because less number of switchings can be done between the processes, and also its simplicity. Because of its simplicity, a non-preemptive scheduling is more attracted by the users. Next one is examples for preemptive scheduling are shortest job first scheduling, round robin scheduling. Okay. Whereas the examples for non-preemptive scheduling are only FCFS, first come first serve scheduling. Which process comes first? The CPU is allocated to that process in the case of first come first serve scheduling. In the round robin scheduling, a time quantum is given, a fixed time quantum is given. After the time quantum, the CPU is immediately releases from the executing process. Then that can be allocated to another process for the fixed time quantum. Okay. So this can be done in a round fashion. So then we can say that this type of scheduling is called as round robin scheduling. Okay. So these are the main differences between preemptive scheduling and non-preemptive scheduling. Okay. In the summary, the main difference between preemptive scheduling and non-preemptive scheduling is, in the case of preemptive scheduling, so the executing process cannot be interrupted. The executing process can be interrupted by any other process in the middle of the execution. Whereas in the case of non-preemptive scheduling, the executing process cannot be interrupted by another process in the middle of the execution. Okay. Preemptive scheduling is somewhat complex because more number of switching can be done between the processes. So it is very difficult to understand by the users. But so that we can say that preemptive scheduling is not attractive. Whereas in the case of non-preemptive scheduling, so less number of switching can be done between the processes, so that it is very easy to understand by the users. So we can say that non-preemptive scheduling is more attractive. Next one, preemptive scheduling is cost associative. So the scheduling can be done in preemptive scheduling. It can take more cost because the CPU is switching between the processes multiple times, so that it is more cost effective. But in the case of non-preemptive scheduling, less number of switchings can be done, so that the cost is also less. Okay. But the non-preemptive scheduling is less efficient compared to the preemptive scheduling. Next one is preemptive scheduling is more flexible, whereas non-preemptive scheduling is less flexible. So these are the summary of comparison of preemptive scheduling and non-preemptive scheduling. So thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, please subscribe my channel name. So Divvela Srinivasa.